Today I was asked to speak on behalf of Occupy ICE-LA. I've been doing migrant justice work for over 4 years. I began to get involved in abolition community organizing when I was in high school, and then in undergrad there was a bunch of us who formed a coalition, Students of Color Solidarity Coalition in the UC system, because the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, was undemocratically appointed as UC president. So that's when I began to notice that those who were administrating this genocidal regime started infiltrating our public institutions, our public education institutions. And that's when I first began to hear about the privatization of the prison business. And then the summer of 2014, much like Fred said, there was increased media attention on the mass migration of undocumented refugee youth from Central America, and I couldn't look away as a Central American woman, understanding my own migration story and how our transnational family has been impacted by the forced migration of people from my homelands, my family's homelands. And so that's when I started to pay attention to the causes of forced migration. And there's a lot of organizing work that I've done as a Central American woman, so I just want to remind folks that I'm here presenting to you my participation in the Occupy ICE-LA encampment as a Central American woman. The camp started in response to Jeff Sessions' zero policy. So in May, Jeff Sessions announced that they would be implementing a zero tolerance policy, so folks that would be caught crossing the border illegally would be imprisoned and separated, and as opposed to asking for asylum at the border in a formal way that's actually recognized legally, recognized by international law. And even then, people are separated upon requesting asylum at the border. So that's what the encampments were in response to. The first encampment was in Portland, and that inspired people in LA. I don't know how many of you all know Maya Rose Burko, who is a community member here in Topanga. She answered a call to action that I put out, and her and some other folks who had experience in the Standing Rock encampments put together the Occupy ICE-LA encampment, and it's going on its 42nd day, I want to say. And so they've done so much, we've done so much in the time that we've been out there. I can't say that I've camped there every night, but I know some people who have, and it's really remarkable. What's come out of this is that there's been a lot of coalition building with a lot of different organizations in Los Angeles. There's been a lot of teach-ins, and there's been a lot of evolution on how to run the camp. Something that we're seeing on a national level. We have a national thread on a safe security text messaging app. So we have one for our encampment, and we have one that's nationally, so we can stay in communication with other encampments. There's an encampment in Denver, New York, San Francisco, San Diego, San Antonio, Louisville, Kentucky, Seattle, or Tacoma in Washington, Portland. Don't know if I'm forgetting somewhere, but there are a lot of encampments right now, and we're in communication with each other, so this is a movement that's gaining momentum. Our messaging is abolish ICE, abolish immigration and customs enforcement, and it's been really beautiful to see who shows up and to build community with people. Something that has been happening, a lot of the encampments have been raided by police. In Portland, we saw hyper-militarization of the raiding of the camp. I mean, a lot of the camps have disbanded due to raids, such as the San Francisco camp in the past few days. Tacoma was raided. Philly, there's another encampment in Philly. And San Antonio was attacked by Nazis. And I've heard there's been harassment while I've been at the camp here in LA. And just in the past 2 days, Department of Homeland Security has been driving by and really scoping out the situation. Some encampments have received eviction notices and soon after have been raided by police. Some encampments, some of the folks who are holding down the encampments are receiving $1,000 tickets for having furniture out there. Some of them have built barricades to obstruct the driveways of ICE run facilities. And something that's also happening within the groups is that some folks do organizing through other organizations. So we've just been weaving our networks to plug into National Days of Action and to also coordinate local Days of Action.
These children are totally traumatized by the time we get them. They're traumatized by the gang attack on them in their home country, either threatening them or raping the girls, whatever, that they're traumatized. Then they're traumatized when their mother and father decide to put them in the hands of a coyote. They have to say goodbye and know that they may never see their parents again. Then they make this horrible trip across Mexico, which is a third trauma. And when they get to the border, expecting to reach the promised land, they're treated like criminals and they're put into these detention centers. The detention centers have a room, all of them have a room they call the refrigerator, the helera. It's a little bigger than this room, and they'll have maybe 30 or 40 children in it, no beds, sleeping on the floor, and the temperature is kept at 55 degrees 24 hours a day.
Oh my God.
The lights are never turned off. Jay Johnson, and to put this in perspective, Mr. Obama, I voted for Mr. Obama twice, and I would probably vote for him again tomorrow. He was terrible on immigration. He was terrible on immigration. He deported more than 2 million people in these 8 years. More than 1,000 people a day were deported by Mr. Obama. And he prepared the groundwork for the horror that we're experiencing now. It's much worse now. I'm not trying to say it's equal. It's much worse. But it was terrible under Obama. We had people in our congregation who were prisoners in Adelanto. You saw that in the movie. A horrible place. It's a modern building. Very efficient and all, but the people are treated very badly. They're made to work for $1 a day. They're given terrible food. The government pays them $350 a day for every body they have in the prison. $350. They could be at a Hilton enjoying 5-star meals for $350 a day. But they're there and they're being fed very poorly and so on. Anyway, these children are put into these detention centers and they're kept there. According to the normal procedure, when they come here, they all have a name and address of a relative here, an uncle, an aunt, maybe in some cases their mother who came here 10 years ago to make money to support the family, and grandma's taking care of the kids back home. And they come here unaccompanied, and they should be, when they get there, they say, I'm here, I need refuge because of this and that. They tell their story. They should be put on a bus or an airplane immediately and sent to the family whose name they have, their uncle or their aunt. No, they're put in a detention center. Most of them are kept there for about a month in the helera. When we get them, they all have upper respiratory disease infections because of the conditions they've been in addition to the 4 traumas that they've experienced. They come to their foster family, an aunt or an uncle that they've never seen. It's a stranger, but it is a relative, and these people are very caring. Most of them are wanting very much to help these children. But they're poor. And most of the foster families are living in a 2-bedroom apartment, maybe 8 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment because they have to have 3 or 4 people working to pay the $1,400 a month rent for this little apartment. And so here comes another person. The Children and Family Services has opened up a loophole here. Normally, if you put a child into foster care, they have to have their own bedroom. Well, that's impossible. So they allow these children to even sleep on the sofa. That's something Children and Family Services are permitting, which is a blessing because otherwise I don't know where they would be. But the family is receiving them, and Latina families are very family-oriented. They're very loving, and because this is my nephew or my niece, they will make real sacrifices to bring them in, but it's not easy because they've got 4 kids of their own who are American kids. They speak good English, they're going to school, and so on. And here comes this brown kid, they're all brown, but here comes this other brown kid who doesn't speak English, who doesn't know what's going on, who's terrified, traumatized, and the meshing of these families is not always easy. People are working hard at it, but it's very difficult. Actually, over 140,000 children have come to the United States unaccompanied from Central America since 2014. Making the trip you saw on the Beast, it's incredible what they have gone through to get here. They are coming, fleeing for their lives, because gang violence has taken over El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. In the 1980s, Mr. Reagan declared war against the peoples of Central America. He was, as you know, a fanatical anti-communist. He could not distinguish between Sandinista and Comunista, and he figured that everybody in Central America was going communist. So he started funding the military in those countries to put down any movement, labor movements, labor unions, any people protesting for human rights. It resulted in wars that killed literally thousands of people in those countries. And in the 1980s, thousands of people fled those countries and came to the United States, particularly from El Salvador. They brought their children with them, of course. And a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old came when they were that age in 1982, 1984. They grew up in Los Angeles. They all too often got drawn into the gang violence in Los Angeles. They were recruited by the gangs here. In the 1990s, the LAPD came up with a brilliant idea of solving their gang problem by deporting all of these children back to their country of origin. Well, they didn't deport all of them, but they deported several thousand of them to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. They arrived there, they had no skills except gang violence, and so they formed gangs. Immediately they made an alliance with the narcos from Colombia, who were using Central America as a staging point to bring drugs into the United States. And then they made an alliance with the Mexican mafia. And so the State Department itself said about 18 months ago, it issued a declaration that all 3 of these countries are controlled by organized crime. The gangs, the narcos, and the Mexican mafia. And the governments are corrupted and intimidated by these gangs. The woman who has a little cart on the corner selling bananas, like our taco trucks here, except much more humble, has to pay $20 a month to the gang to be in business. They call it the rent. If they have a person who has a restaurant, they have to pay $500 a month to the gang in order to stay in business. And if you don't pay, they kill you, or they kill your children. Another piece of things that is going on is they recruit the children. They'll say to a 10-year-old boy, we want you to join our gang, here's a pistol, we want you to go down and kill the baker on the corner to show us how brave you are and to become a part of our gang. He goes home and tells his mom, and she goes into panic, borrows $6,000 from a loan shark at 10% a month interest, hands him over to the coyote, who puts him on the train and brings him to the United States. They are allowed to come here and ask for refugee status based upon a law signed by, believe it or not, George W. Bush. His last year in the presidency, 2008, he signed a law allowing any minor child who comes to the United States asking for refuge to be given an opportunity to get that refugee status. So the people who are blaming the Democrats for all this are just kind of missing the point. There was a George W. Bush law. One of the, excuse me here, but it's one of the few decent things a man ever did in his whole life was to sign that law. Mr. Sessions in May announced that gang violence and domestic violence would no longer be considered causes to be granted refugee status. Well, that's the basis which all these people are coming. They're either coming because of gang violence or because of domestic violence. We received 2 children 3 weeks ago tomorrow from Guatemala. They came with their mother. They were separated at the border. The children were put into a detention center and then into an albergue, which is kind of like a hostel. And the mother was put in a prison in Arizona. They came because the husband, beat the mother and beat the children and beat an older daughter to the point that she died. And so the mother decided that she had to flee for her life and the life of their children. That's why they came. Now Mr. Sessions is saying, well, that's not a valid reason for coming. So we don't know what's going to happen in this case.
What was the 55-degree temperature about? Why?
Mr. Jay Johnson, who was the head of Homeland Security under President Obama, made a speech in January of 2016 in which he declared, we are mistreating these people as they come on purpose, so they'll send a message back to other people not to come.
Oh.
It's to intimidate, which is unbelievably cynical. But that's why they're doing it. But why do they have to keep them there for? Sometimes they're kept there for a month at that temperature. And
It's torture. That's what it is. It's torture.
Unfortunately, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, supported the overthrow of the elected president in Honduras in June of 2009 and established a military government, which later on segued into a kangaroo election, and they now have an elected president, but only the ultra-right wing were allowed to run. Honduras is, San Pedro Sula, as it said in here, is the murder capital of the world now, in terms of percentages. I've been to San Pedro Sula when I lived in Costa Rica for 12 years. I lived in Latin America for 32 years. I was in Brazil, Costa Rica, Panama, and Nicaragua. And back in the 80s in San Pedro Sula was really a delightful city, a very pleasant place, right on the ocean, or very close to it. Today, it is just a war zone. Now, all of these three countries are effectively failed states because the government is either totally corrupt and sold out to the gangs or dominated by the gangs, and they're just not able to protect their people.
With that being said, though, I do want to remind people that gangs are in Central America because gangs formed in Los Angeles in response to racism by Caucasian people. So the gangs that formed in the earlier 20th century formed in response to violence by members of the KKK. So that's why African American gangs formed, that's why Mexican gangs formed, and then when folks were forced to migrate from El Salvador due to U.S. military intervention that that exacerbated the civil war that was happening in El Salvador. Salvadorian youth did not have protection from Mexican or African American gangs, as well as racist violence by members of the KKK. So then they formed MS-13, La Mara Salvatrucha, and then there was competition amongst gangs for resources in impoverished neighborhoods. Something to also keep in mind is that the U.S. has been intervening in Central America since the early 20th century. In Guatemala, for example, the U.S. backed the coup of a democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz, who was redistributing land to campesinos so that they would have autonomy to grow their own food. So I think when we talk about what's happening right now, we can't ignore that there's been decades of U.S. military intervention in our homelands, and that's why we're here. And it's not, like, sure, they're failed states, but it's because the U.S. is a failed state, and it's an imperial power that's forcing destabilization of our homelands so that it can monopolize our resources. And so something that I also wanted to talk about is that we can't talk about ending or abolishing ICE without talking about ending the war on drugs, because it's also tied into the war on drugs, because the war on drugs was declared in 2006, which was soon after the war on terror was declared, and it's been used as a premise to deport people and to send military aid into Central America. And what happens with that military aid? The arms that are produced by the U.S. are disseminated into the hands of people who are extremely traumatized from decades of military intervention and also longer legacies of colonialism. So what's happening is that folks are being deported from here for being involved with gangs, and then when they're there, they're exposed to conditions where there's a proliferation of arms. These arms fall into the hands of cartels who are closely tied to the militaries of these corrupt governments, and what they do with these arms is that they force indigenous communities out of their lands so that foreign corporations can take over natural resources that get consumed by first world consumers. So if we talk about the forced migration that's happening, we can't talk about we can't forget that it's also happening because of the war on drugs and how there's an intersection with cartel violence and the forced migration of indigenous communities so that there's a plunder of their natural resources.
In 1947, President Truman organized the Central Intelligence Agency with the desire of having a central organization that would control all of the intelligence agencies of the American government. Sounds good. In 1953, the CIA overthrew the elected government of Iran and established the Shah of Iran as a dictator. He ruled that country ruthlessly, murdering people for about 40 years. In 1954, as she said, they overthrew the elected government in Guatemala. The result of that has been the murder of over 200,000, mostly indigenous people in Guatemala by the governments that have been supported and kept in office by the U.S. government. El Salvador is the same thing, and Honduras we've already mentioned. All of these countries have been virtually destroyed by the interference of the United States of America. It goes back earlier, it goes back into the 19th century. We didn't start this just in the mid-20th century, it goes back further. The Monroe Doctrine in 1823, President Monroe said that the Western Hemisphere belongs to us. We didn't have the power to enforce that at the time, but we established the policy, and since then we've been making that our rule. We don't allow anybody else to come in. One of the problems right now is that China is beginning to invest in Latin America and beginning to have some influence because they're helping the people. And that is making our government increasingly nervous. The LAPD does not cooperate with ICE. That's official policy. I'm sure there probably are some exceptions, some individual cops are not, but the official policy is that. And the senior lead officer in North Hills comes to our church once a month and tells everyone that we will not report. If you get, well, it's mainly, he's concerned about domestic violence. If a woman, the husband is saying, if you call the cops, you'll be deported. And so they're afraid to call. And he says, no, call the cops, you will not be deported if you call and report domestic violence. We will take your husband, put him in jail, and you'll be safe if you need it. But we do not cooperate with ICE, and that's a wonderful thing that the LAPD has been doing. But the sheriff is a different animal. It's very bad. So if, for instance, somebody is caught by the sheriff's patrols, DUI or something like that, they're in real trouble because they'll go to the sheriff's jail, and while they're there, they'll tell ICE, and when they get out of jail, they may find themselves on their way out of the country. I just want to, as my last comments, we had a horrendously tragic thing happen about 5 months ago. You're all familiar with DACA? These children who were brought here, these people were brought here as children, now they're young adults, and but they don't have legal status because they were brought here without proper documents. And Mr. Trump has said, no more, you're going to be deported. Well, the courts have stopped him on that, but he's still working on it. About 5 months ago, a man in our neighborhood in North Hills who grew up here, his parents came here from Guatemala when he was 7 years old. And his parents have been here ever since. The whole family came. And he grew up here. His Spanish is not good. He can't communicate well in Spanish, and he knows nothing about Guatemala. He's scared to death. He was scared to death that he would be deported back to Guatemala because he doesn't know anybody in Guatemala, he doesn't speak Spanish, etc. He had a fender bender in North Hills, modest one, and the owner of the other car was fine. He said, no, I've got insurance, don't worry. They were signing names, exchanging names and all, when a neighbor came out and said, I'm gonna call the police. And the guy said, no, please don't call the police. Begged him not to call, but he was very macho and he called the police. Well, when the police car turned the corner, this guy jumped in his car and drove off. He was so scared, he drove off about 10 minutes away, sat in his car a while, and then shot himself to death. He was 40 years old, left a wife and 4 children, but he was so terrorized at the thought of being deported. Now, there are 800,000 young people in this country who are in DACA. There is another 1 million young people who didn't sign up for DACA because they didn't want to give all of their information to the government, who are in the DACA status. And they're all subject to being deported now. 1,800,000 young American citizens that grew up here. And they're all in panic right now. Now, if Mr. Trump starts deporting some of those people, I can guarantee you we will have an epidemic of suicides. Even if it's only 1%. What is 1% of 1,000,008? It's a lot of people. And this is what's going on. These people are living in terror. We live in a terror state now.